I'm Lenore Hakakian, and welcome back to 881 News. The percentage of adolescent smoking is on the rise. Nearly 2 million U.S. youth use e-cigarettes, and 1 in 4 teenagers use them daily. As smoking continues to increase as an addictive behavior, the effects that cigarettes and e-cigarettes have on our bodies are important to investigate. One of the main parts of the body that is influenced by smoking is the lungs. And in order to dive deeper into this topic, my colleague Sylvie will now introduce how the lungs function so we can then understand how they are impacted.
Thank you, Lenore. Without oxygen, we would be unable to function as each part of our body requires oxygen to keep going. Oxygen is stored and transferred from our lungs to our tissues through the use of myoglobin and hemoglobin. While myoglobin acts as a storage depot for oxygen, hemoglobin binds oxygen to be released when needed. Both of these proteins use heme, a non-protein compound, in order for the oxygen molecules to reversibly and tightly attach to them. Specifically in hemoglobin, the heme group changes the shape of the entire compound when bound to oxygen. This change in conformation allows the protein to hold on to the oxygen tighter, or for the protein to be more inclined to release it. In other words, the heme allows change between a high affinity to low affinity oxygenated state. When oxygen is saturated in the blood, this process happens much quicker. However, when the hemoglobin is bound by something other than oxygen, such as carbon dioxide, this process is inhibited and the body will show a much lower oxygen saturation. As we now know a little bit more about oxygen binding and why it is a crucial part of our body system, we are now going to go live to hear from Jermaine interviewing people who smoke right now.
Thank you so much for the insight, Sylvie. Here I'm in New York City, which has one of the most prominent smoking populations in all of America. Here I'm joined by Queens resident Mr. Roy Stokes, where he will discuss how his 30 years of smoking has affected his physical well-being. Mr. Roy Stokes, how does it feel, you being a heavy smoker, pertaining to your lungs?
Me being a heavy smoker, it makes me feel out of breath at times.
Thank you so much for that input. Now, would you say that smoking has affected you for the worse as you've gotten older?
Yes, it does. And what it does also, it makes me
a little wheeze.
Makes me hurt.
Of course, that can be attributed, as you probably know, from the hemoglobin shift curve going to the left to the right in terms of oxygen saturation. Would you say this increase in the P50 value has made your life a lot harder as you've gotten older, or has it stayed about the same?
Even though I got a little older, it's even gotten worse. You could hardly walk up my stairs as I would like to.
Thank you, Jermaine. It is important to now investigate the detrimental side effects that smoking has on the lungs and oxygen binding. As my colleague Sylvie just taught us, when molecules other than oxygen are present in the blood, it becomes increasingly difficult for oxygen to bind. Specifically, carbon monoxide has a binding affinity that is 200-fold stronger than that of oxygen. Carbon monoxide is produced when tobacco, a main ingredient of cigarettes, is burned incompletely. Given this increase, there is a rise in the carbon monoxide blood hemoglobin concentration and less of a chance for oxygen to bind to hemoglobin. This buildup of carbon monoxide due to the ingredients in cigarettes starves the body of oxygen. Although exposure to low levels of carbon monoxide produces relatively low levels of carboxyhemoglobin, with a decrease in oxygen carrying capacity, carbon monoxide also enhances oxygen hemoglobin affinity. These two abnormalities in oxygen delivery could combine to interfere significantly with tissue oxygen supply. The issues in oxygen delivery could lead to erythrocytosis, which is an increase in red blood cells, and tissue hypoxia. As we are now in the middle of a pandemic, we are wondering how smoking affects those with COVID. We brought in Dr. Vivian to explain current research on whether smokers suffer from an increased risk of respiratory failure.
Thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Vivian. As we know, especially during times of COVID-19, protecting our lungs is of paramount importance. Evidence is already showing that smoking is associated with increased risk of severe COVID-19 with respiratory failure and hospitalization. Additionally, we have already seen that smoking is correlated with increased risk of severe respiratory infections in general. Smokers were seen to have higher risk of hospital admissions and death during previous influenza epidemics. We have seen that smoking injures the local defenses in the lung by increasing mucus production and inflammation. Exaggerated inflammation causes increased levels of tissue damage and leads to more severe reactions to respiratory illnesses. Even the fact that smoking is a social behavior makes it more likely for smokers to catch and pass on the virus. Additionally, children exposed to secondhand smoke have been seen to have more severe responses when infected with respiratory viruses. It is clear that smoking is associated with more severe respiratory illness, and during this time it is especially important to keep safe. I brought my colleague Pedro here to explain other side effects and issues that could occur from smoking.
Hi, Vivian. Thank you for that. Like you said, smokers have been deemed by the CDC to be at higher risk of infection or more serious complications from COVID, with the same applying to individuals who use vape products. There is a common misconception that vaping is a safe alternative to smoking, but recent studies have shown otherwise. Harvard researchers have analyzed the chemical composition of 51 different e-cigarette brands and have found that 39 of 51 brands contain diacetyl, and 23 and 26 of 51 flavors contain 2,3-pentadiol and acetylene, all chemicals known to cause popcorn lung. Other studies have identified vitamin E acetate in the composition, which has been strongly tied to increase in pneumonia-like symptoms, lung damage, and decrease in oxygen levels. Though we cannot yet confirm the long-term effects of vaping, a study from the University of Pennsylvania has shown that just after one vaping session, the acceleration of blood through the femoral artery dropped by 25% and a decrease in hemoglobin saturation by 20%, which suggests that a long-term vaping could induce serious arterial stiffening and lead to heart disease. With a large portion of today's youth exposing themselves to unknown and possibly lethal agents on a regular basis, it's important that we address the potential risks of smoking and vaping now and for the future. We hope that today's segment has provided you all with a greater insight on the dangerous impact that smoking and vaping has on your lungs and their oxygen binding capacities. This is 818 News, and thank you for watching.